Reaching 30 years old is a very special age. It's a very special milestone in your life. When you're 30, you're going to start realizing who was real for you and who wasn't. Because around the time where you hit 30, that's when you really get over important relationships to you. Because when you turn 30, you start to realize that you don't have time to worry about things that are not important. So because you start to remove yourself from things that are not important, you're going to start realizing that some of the people that you left behind when you were younger, they were actually solid people. They were actually good people. Being 30 years old, that's around the time that your grandparents start to pass away. So you start to realize how important family is. You start to realize that even though you made so many decisions in your 20s, being indecisive about decisions you made. 30 is really around the time you start realizing that you need credit. Because when you're in your 20s, you don't really give a damn about credit. You just look, am I approved? Am I approved or not? That's all that matters. But 30 around the time when you start realizing how important credit is. 30 is around the time you start to realize how important your health is. And as long as you have your health, you can always take care of the things you need. 30 is around the time that you see that your body can recover, but you're going to need more sleep. 30 is when you really know if you really want children or not. And if you make it to 30 and you don't have kids, that's usually around the time when you're okay with not having children, because you start to understand that what's the point of bringing children into a world that you know you can't take care of them, or you know that you won't be able to be there for them like they deserve. 30 is around the time when you start being okay with going to sleep at 9 o'clock. 30 around the time when you actually would rather be inside, because you realize going to the club, seeing the same people, do the same thing every weekend is not fulfilling and it's a waste of time. 30 is usually around the time when you start to realize you're tired of taking orders from people, and you've been through enough in your life, you've learned enough in your life to either move up in your company or start your own business. 30 is when you start to realize how important vacations are. When you're 20 or when you're in your 20s, it's very easy to be entertained. But when you start hitting your 30s, you start realizing you've done almost everything you can do already in the US, and none of the problems you have are ever going to go away. So you need to relax and take a breather, and you need to go somewhere where you can decompress and restart. And nothing's better than leaving the country or leaving your city, leaving your town to take a vacation. When you hit your 30s, you realize that. When you hit your 30s, you start to understand that there was never a good time to disrespect your parents, even if you know that they was wrong. Because your parents, you start to understand that your parents make decisions based on what they thought was in your best interest. Usually a good parent would do that. But most of the time, a lot of us have parents at young ages, and parents tend to learn as they go. They make bad decisions, and you start to gain wisdom to understand that it's not your place to judge your parents. Your parents, they always gonna do what they think is best for you in a situation if they really love you. And even if you know they was wrong, you know not to correct them, because it comes with honoring your parents. When you hit 30, you start to realize that you need to spend more time with your younger siblings, because your younger siblings are gonna go through everything that you went through in your 20s or your teens. And it's going to be very important for you to have the patience to sit down and spend time with them. Not necessarily tell them what to do, because they're not going to listen anyway, but at least give them guidance enough to where they're comfortable to talk to you about things, and where you can steer them in the right direction. Ironically, when you're in your 30s, you tend to listen more, because you're more interested in learning than trying to tell people what you know. Because when you're younger, when you're like a teenager in your 20s and stuff, man, it's like you feel like you know everything. You know the world. You feel like nobody can tell you anything. But when you hit your 30s, it's the opposite. You gravitate to learning more, knowing more about things that you feel like you probably should have been knew. Your 30s is around the time you start to realize how important it is to schedule things. Because you have so many responsibilities, you can't just go along winging things, because if you don't schedule your time properly, you will waste a lot of time. You have to put yourself on the schedule. And when you hit your 30s, you start to realize that when you got to help people with their responsibilities, when you got to pay your bills, when you got to take someone somewhere, when you have to go run errands, when you got to do schoolwork, when you got to work, when you got to pick somebody up, you start to realize how important scheduling is. You start to realize that listening to older music is not what make you an old head. People in their 30s start to listen to older music when they was younger because it reminds them of the good times. It reminds them of times that they spent with their cousins or their siblings or their grandparents. And you start to understand that the ideas that your grandparents, your parents gave you, and the culture that your family gave you is important. You start to understand why your parents try to instill culture in you, because the culture they give you, the culture your family gives you, your grandparents and your elders give you, that's like your identity of who you are. You're going to waste a lot of time in relationships with people that you think you're going to be with forever. 30s is when you're going to realize how happy you are that you did not have children with the wrong person. If you made it to not having kids by the time you're 30, the dependability of a car is a lot more important than what the car look like. Your 30s is when you stop caring about what is trending and you start dressing the way that you want to dress. You start wearing clothes that you like, and you don't really care about how you look when you go out in public, when you're just doing things like running errands. Like, you'll be 30 years old, you'll see somebody 30 years old that's going to order food in a drive-thru that'll be wearing pajamas. That's how much we don't care. Your 30s is when you want to start challenging yourself and do hobbies that you probably did not see was interesting when you were younger. Maybe reading, maybe science, maybe math, maybe vlogging, maybe learning history. Things like that become very important to you when you're in your 30s. Typically, your 30s is when you stop to care about what other people think of you physically, maybe your height, your hair, stuff like that. You start to really accept yourself for who you are, typically around the time you're in your 30s. I know people can say that when they're younger, but let's be real, there's always things people want to change or improve about themselves. But when you're in your 30s, you kind of like get to a point where you're like, look, I am who I am. Either you're going to like me the way I am or you're not, or you're going to get to stepping. People that decided to get married and have children in high school or straight out of high school, typically they ruin their life. 30 is when you reflect on who you slept with and you are disgusted with yourself, unfortunately. When you're in your 30s, you start to realize that, look, you got a timeline and you need to make sure that you utilize your time the most effectively so that you can be retired by the time you're 40. That's all 30-year-old plans. That's what we want to do. Retire early. That's everybody's plan when they hit them 30s. Your 30s is around the time when you learn how to curse people out professionally. When I say curse them out professionally, I mean you can insult them without having to curse them out. You can insult them using any racial or ignorant slurs. For example, let's say you go to the store or you go to a restaurant and you're trying to order some food and somebody don't know what they're doing. A 30-year-old could say, well, I understand, you just started working here, so I get it. They just threw you up here. See that? I'm insulting your work ethic without cursing you out. When you hit 30s, you learn how to do stuff like that. When you turn 30, that's around the time you start to reflect on how much things you were talented in when you were younger, but you never actually pursued it, or you never pursued it correctly, or you didn't take it seriously. And then you realize, yo, I could have been the next Marvin Gaye. I could have been the next Beyonce. I could have been the next LeBron James. I could have been the next Benjamin Banneker. But I was too caught up in needing validation and doing the wrong things at the wrong time and wasting a lot of my youth. When you're in your 30s, you start to realize that you're okay with being by yourself because most of the people you meet are going to be full of shit. And it's not personal. It's due to the fact that most people who live this life, they're just trying to pursue what their fulfillment is as an individual. Don't take it personally. When people screw you over, when people lie to you, when people mistreat you, it's not personal. It's hard to not take it personally in your 20s because you moving so fast. You be thinking these are people that you're going to be with for the rest of your life. But as you get older and you start to see the pattern of people, you start to see what people do over and over again, it's really difficult for people to disappoint you because you start to realize that most people are full of shit and most people are doing things to fulfill themselves. So it's not ever personal. So your standard for people will be much lower when you hit 30.